This podcast is part of OctOSR, the October-long celebration of old school games, old school rule sets, and old school styles of play. For OctOSR this year, I'm going to be going over Muster, a Primer of War, advice for playing D&D in the wargaming way, published by Arkenstone Publishing, written by Eero Tuovinen. It can be found on the Arkenstone Publishing page on DriveThruRPG. The PDF is pay what you want, and I will include a link in the show notes. As we finish up this month of October, in this year's OctOSR, I'm going to finish up the section on Muster entitled Technical Things to Do. Weapons and Armor. This is on page 96. D&D has a history of being pretty over-obsessed with weaponry. At first, it was apparently due to the game's technical background in wargaming, and later on, just this fashion statement that has kept going to this day, appealing to give players something to do by puttering about with equipment details of their character. Because this complication is neither particularly realistic nor particularly interesting, I would recommend dropping most of the cruft in this area, all things being equal. Your campaign is probably not going to be one where a sword and an axe should play out differently in the combat mechanics. Frankly, if they only ever did for the sake of board game guild. If you end up ripping out this part of the traditional game system, consider replacing it with a simple system where all characters cause 1d6 damage on a successful attack, but they take a circumstance penalty to hit when using weapons inappropriate to the situation. It doesn't need to be any more complex than this. Most of the rest of the elaborate D&D construction around weapons lists and armors and such is of incremental benefit only. Definitely it is the case that nobody should let that edifice become an obstacle to their game. There are so many more interesting and substantial affairs the game has the potential to tackle. In summary, consider letting character equipment mainly be a color thing. It's not such an important and interesting subgame in the big picture. So stepping away from the text, OD&D, as I recall, actually did this. If you had a successful hit on an opponent in OD&D, you did 1d6 damage, regardless of the weapon you were using, plus whatever magic or strength bonuses you happen to have. I think in this case, he's using the term equipment to talk entirely about combat, weapons, and armor. Armor does, I think, make more of a difference than weapons because you have the potential for maybe not the slight degrees of improvement that D&D armor has, but something along the lines of light, medium, and heavy armor giving you more protection versus more stealth versus more agility or speed available to you. That makes for interesting decisions. And of course, in terms of other equipment, a lot of OSR style play, old school play, is around the type of equipment that you have that lets you get through varying situations. The famous 10-foot pole, for example, or did you bring enough rope to scale climbs you're going to have to make or climb down into the pits you're going to have to descend, things of that nature. And that's considered part of the player skill part of the OSR style game, is knowing what kind of equipment to bring as you have planned for the journey you have ahead of you, which in turn means doing research, asking questions, listening to rumors, questioning those who have been where you're about to go, so you know what sort of equipment to bring, because, of course, managing that encumbrance is part of that game, too. All right, so moving on to page 97, Healing Rules. Mainline D&D is encumbered by a technical paradox of how the recovery of hit points is envisioned. On the one hand, it is widely understood that hit points cannot act as an exciting heroic action safety buffer if they cannot be recovered fairly quickly and easily. But, on the other hand, the game's earliest iterations insisted on equating hit points with physical injuries, which would then naturally be slow to heal, even setting aside wound fever and other foibles of realism. This was, of course, unproblematic in the original 74 campaign context, concerned strictly with basic dungeoneering expeditions. The contradiction between hit points being adventurous and slow to heal simultaneously only became pressing later. The paradox was resolved historically by leaning hard on healing magic. a specific type of resource carried by specialized adventurers called clerics. Any given D&D text you have on hand is likely to introduce the conceit. It does resolve the immediate problem of making hit points recoverable in a reasonable adventuring time frame, but the downside is clerics are literally awkward for most purposes, tastes differ, and unsuitable to many campaign settings. Technical tradition recognizes various alternatives to relying on clerics. For a simple and quick solution you can throw into most rules treatments, I recommend simply saying that adventurers recover all hit points in a long rest, camping for a sleep cycle or more, excepting those lost to lingering causes, hunger, heat stroke, poison, etc., which are then only recovered after addressing the root cause of the loss. This simple rule fixes many of the glaring weaknesses in the traditional scheme while hewing close to the intended spirit of the 74 rules. In summary, decide if the cleric-based hit point recovery works for your campaign. If it doesn't, maybe just say that natural rest recovers the entire HP pool overnight. Stepping outside the rules, stepping outside the text again, the argument over HP has been around for as long as there's been D&D. What does HP represent? Is it purely physical, the physical fortitude of your body, your health? Is it luck? Is it your ability to assess a situation? Is it your effectiveness at dealing with the challenges that come your way? There have been a lot of interpretations as to what hit points are. And of course, without knowing exactly what hit points are, you can't really know all the ways that make sense to get them back once you've lost them. If it has something to do with your mental faculties, then overnight sleep makes sense that you would recover a lot of them. If it's strictly physical health, then it would take long-term help without some sort of magical healing that you have available to you. If it's luck, it simply may be a case of you can only go against luck for so long before it catches up with you, and then you would have to take maybe an extended rest, extended time away from adventuring in order to recover that. Is it favor of the gods? You could fall out of favor with the gods, and then where are you? What would you have to do what kind of quest would you have to go on to regain that? So there's a lot mixed into the hit point concept, and people have gone back and forth on it, and it's an interesting conversation. And of course, this is a fairly simple solution that he offers, which digs into sort of the modern game, but giving you the idea that there are types of hit point depletion that are physically related, being poisoned, being hungry, and that until you assess that or deal with that, then you can't regain those hit points back. So you couldn't get to your hit point maximum if you haven't eaten in 3 days. You can't get back to your hit point maximum if you're under the oppressive sun of the desert for a long period of time and you can't find shelter and shade and a way to cool down. So that would lead to some interesting things from a resource management perspective that the OSR kind of thrives on, with things like water and food and resources that you have to carry with you, and weighing that against other types of equipment, and even being able to plan for your journey. Where are you going to go, especially in a hostile environment, that you can give yourself enough shelter to recover from whatever physical ailments the environment may put on you. So a lot tied up into HP, and a lot of discussion to be had about HP, and I'm not going to go a lot long on that here. I'm going to continue into the text again, which, relating directly to the hit point section almost, the next section is casualty rules. Older D&D rules tend to describe characters falling to 0 hit points as dead. This is, to my best understanding, an early preferred simplification that still stands on its merits for any scenario where you simply don't want to bother with injuries, triage, treatment of crippled veterans, and so on. All legit topics for sure, but not for all games. Later on, the rules have generally gotten more realistic in this regard, perhaps driven by an unhygienic desire to provide fudge space for a referee desiring to decide that beloved character is only nearly dead, so to speak. I'm going to step outside of the text again for just a second here, because he used the term unhygienic there to describe using not using 0 hit points equals death as a way to give the referee an ability to fudge. He uses the term unhygienic desire. I'm going to go back into his glossary here to what he calls procedural hygiene. Procedural hygiene is a refereeing practice where you intentionally choose methods, procedures, and rules that reduce the possibility of unconscious bias in referee decision making. Not merely the absence of corruption, but the avoidance of even the possibility. For example, pre-committing to rolling random encounter checks every turn is more hygienic than choosing to do it when you feel like it, because the latter involves a greater chance of inappropriate bias to the decision. This concept is kind of important, and then he mentions that he's going to reference it later in the text, and we will get to that eventually. But I did want to go into what he means when he says unhygienic. He's talking about a procedure within the game that even gives the appearance that the referee would have the opportunity to make a biased decision. So so getting back to the text. Later on, the rules have generally gotten more realistic in this regard, perhaps driven by an unhygienic desire to provide fudge space to the referee to decide that beloved character is only nearly dead, so to speak. Or, equally possibly, you might desire to discover that simulation space between being struck down as a casualty of combat and perhaps recovering from it later. In the real world, there is a wide, tragic window of possibility between being uninjured and being dead. I generally recommend using some kind of casualty rules for 2 reasons. The baseline simulation is more realistic if the game actually does measure the idea of injury, and I think it makes for interesting gameplay decisions. The core conceit of 0 HP equals death is too easy on the survivors when they should be struggling with the awful choices that triage and survival would reasonably force on the adventurers. For a simple rules add to an otherwise baseline system, consider this. After a character falls in combat, they get a saving throw to still be alive after the fight. Quick first aid can advantage the roll. Such an injured character would recover to adventure again, but only if they can be brought home despite the injury here and now. To be clear, I do not recommend any fundamental shift to the basic logic of defeat and death in dungeoneering. If an adventurer falls in a fight with monsters and is not recovered by allies in retreat, their fate is surely the same as whatever the casualty rules are like. In summary, characters don't necessarily die at 0 HP. They just become combat casualties, whatever that means in your campaign. So stepping out of the text again, that I do think that the idea of dying at 0 HP, going beyond that to where 0 HP just renders you essentially ineffective and at risk of dying, does provide interesting choices. Because now you have to decide how much will the other characters risk themselves to save their downed comrade. And that's something that in battle situations throughout human history has been, a push and pull on people's actions in combat. Are they going to put themselves and perhaps the others with them more at risk to recover a wounded and dying but not yet dead teammate? And that also will add in again to the OSR concept of preparing for an adventure and what you bring with you and the choices you have to make there. Because if you are going to be a no man left behind type of party, then you may have to bring things with you that would take the place of other adventuring items, things that would enable you to stabilize a nearly mortally wounded teammate, the ability to some type of splints for potential broken bones, the proper salves or ointments of whatever milieu you're operating in to help help injuries, to help wounds heal, stop bleeding, to help them heal maybe a little faster, or make it possible for a badly wounded person to be mobile enough to make it back from the adventure. So it does add a lot of decision in there, but it is simpler to say dead at 0 HP. And then the last heading in this section, skill rules. Older D&D doesn't really have skill rules in the way that's become standard for traditional role-playing games over the years. I would advise considering the reasons carefully and trying out the game without such. One of the big reasons for not having skill rules is that wargamey D&D simulation logic often de-emphasizes character skill and task resolution in a way compared to modern RPG design. For a game coming from the wargaming culture, it makes sense to think of tasks foremost in the terms of resources, manpower, time, money, etc., and inherent risk of complication. The idea of having a big pants expert as part of the adventure party, somebody whose carefully simulated skill rating would be an overwhelming determinant of whether the task succeeds or not, wasn't as obvious as it is in modern role-playing. Unless the campaign has some particular reason to care, I would suggest giving the old style of task resolution a try. It's often more realistic, and it's easier to add skill rules when and if you need them. In summary, try the game without skill rules. You might like it. Stepping outside the text one more time, this section, it doesn't offer you skill rules because he's suggesting doing without them. And there is, if you look at the very early editions of D&D, not a lot to see in the ways of skill. I mean, there wasn't even a thief class in the original D&D, and that's a very skill-based class. And in that circumstance, it would be a matter of being able to succeed or better at doing something, or having a lesser chance might be more about the tools you carry with you. Again, we're talking about logistics, equipment, encumbrance, decision-making process, and preparing for the adventure versus hiring the right people. Is it more party-based? Is it more people-based? Where the magic user is going to try to pick the locks, or the fighter is going to try to check for traps. And you don't have that skill monkey, for lack of a better term, that is very good at very particular things, and you have an entire subsystem dedicated to it. Not that I don't like subsystems. I like a good subsystem. But it is a different style of game, and it is, I think, very fitting with what would be called a wargaming style, where you're considering, where in a war game, you don't necessarily consider, except outside of skirmish games, the individual soldier. You're considering the abilities of the unit. And so an emphasis on the abilities of the unit as a whole to overcome obstacles would be very different from the ability of individual people. It's kind of the difference between, say, a war movie and a heist movie. So that last section of the book and these last couple of episodes of this have been pretty straightforward, because in this case, the author is offering some specific advice. And while I have my own two cents to put in here and there, I think it was important to hear his process, since this book is about playing in a certain style of play that he's advocating. And with that, this month of October for 2003 and this year's OctOSR is over. The continuing going through the book of Muster, a Primer for War, Advice for Playing D&D in a Wargaming Way, is not over. It will continue on into November, and well, hopefully just into November, but if it goes further than that, I'm not opposed to it. I hope those of you who have been listening and those of you who have called in about it and have been following along are not opposed to it as well. In any case, it's been interesting, and there's still more to come. And since I still haven't come up with any kind of standard sign off, I'll just say until next time. I'll have a regular episode out on Thursday. Fingers crossed I don't forget to put it out at the right time, but that's the intention. So until then, thanks for listening. As you may have noticed, if you have the book, I'm not anywhere near finished. In fact, as of this point, I'm less than halfway through everything that's not an appendix. So while this started as something for OctOSR, or OSR October, whatever you prefer to call it, it's going to be something continuing. And I'll probably continue it as part of my regular podcast and also occasional episodes that just are standalones, especially if it's a section that runs on fairly long, because I try to keep the regular podcast, when I can, to keep it to around 30 minutes or a little more, and definitely under an hour. And some of this, both in terms of the material covered and in terms of what I end up having to say about it, will probably expand more. And that will give me time to also read through some of it, additional time, and maybe better organize my thoughts than what I've been doing so far in the series. So just because October is over doesn't mean this is ending. So don't worry if you've been thinking, how's he going to fit all this in? It won't, but it is going to continue on. And I hope those of you who have been following me in this part of the journey, my journey podcasting, will continue to listen. So until next time, I don't really have a standard signed off, so I'm just going to stop talking.